Why Gen Z is walking away from God, and why they are right to question. For the first time in the recorded Western history, a generation is growing up with collectively saying no. No to the church their parents dragged them to, no to the scripture they were told not to mention, no to the moral rules handed down from the ancient text written by men who never seen electricity, never heard of evolution, and believed the earth was the center of the universe, and the people who built those institutions are panicking. They call Gen Z lost, spiritually bankrupt, morally adrift, a generation without values. But what if it's the exact opposite? What if Gen Z is not the first generation to lose faith, but the first generation with enough access to information, enough exposure to the world, and enough philosophical tools to see through everything that the billions of people before them simply never had the chance to examine? What if they are not abandoning the truth? What if they are finally finding it? Part 1. The numbers. What is actually happening? Let's start with the facts because this is not a speculation. This is one of the most truly documented cultural shifts in modern social science. Around one third of Gen Zs, around 34%, identifies as religiously unaffiliated, compared with the 25% of Xers, 19% of baby boomers, and just 15% of the silent generation. More than 1 in 6 Gen Zers, 18%, now firmly identify as either atheist or agnostic. In contrast, fewer than 1 in 10 baby boomers and just 4% of the silent generation identify as atheist and agnostic. Among young women especially, the shift is even more dramatic. In 2024, 40% of women aged 18 to 29 identified as religiously unaffiliated, an 11% point increase from just 29% in 2013. Women ages 18 to 29 are now half as likely as they were in 2013 to report that the religion is the most important thing in their values, in their lives. There is also a little evidence to suggest that Americans who have disaffiliated will ever return. The age at which Americans choose to give up their family's religion most well before they turn 18 suggests that they have not established a deep-rooted commitment to a set religious values and beliefs. Gulub's analyst noted that the decline in religious affiliations is largely a result of generational change, as younger adults who are much more likely to have no religious identity have replaced older generation. But population replacement does not entirely explain the decline. Within each birth cohort, more adults over time has reported that they have no religious identity. This is not a blip. This is not phase. This is a structural, generational, accelerating departure from organized religion, and it demands a real explanation. So, why is it happening? Part 2. The Information Revolution, the single bigger factor. For most human history, religion has an extraordinary advantage over its critics. It controlled information. If you were born in medieval Europe, you had essentially one source of moral, philosophical, and cosmological authority. The church, the priest told you what was true, the scripture told you what was right. Anyone who disagreed was heretic. Anyone who questioned was dangerous. The architecture of information was a monopoly, and religion held the deed. This is not ancient history. Even 50 years ago, environment was largely filtered. You got your worldview from your family, your community, your local religious institution, and the limited media available to you. If everyone around you believed the same things, you had no easy access to alternative perspective. Questioning the foundational framework was not just socially costly, it was practically impossible. You had nothing to question it with. Gen Z is the first generation in human history for whom this monopoly has completely collapsed. More than any other generation, young people today have access to information about alternative views. All you have ever wanted to know was Buddhism or Islam is only a click away, but there's an evidence that internet has helped young atheists who live in religiously conservative communities find like-minded youth. Gen Z has come of age during the exponential rise of permanent installation of social media. Their unlimited instantaneous access to information through the internet has exposed them to an endlessly diversity of perspective and narratives, from politics, race, social justice movements, and every scandal, not all at a global level. Think about what this actually means. A 14-year-old in a rural Alabama sitting in a church on a Sunday morning can, on the same device in their pocket, access the complete works of Charles Darwin, Richard Dawkins, dismantling of cosmological argument, videos, contradictions within biblical scriptures, accounts from survivor of religious abuse, the complete philosophical argument of Nietzsche, Hume, Bertrand Russell, stories from people in 100 other cultures who were raised in completely different religious traditions with equal certainty that their tradition was the only true path. The monopoly is broken. The information is free, and once you have genuinely looked, once you have actually read what the critics say, actually examined the evidence, actually compared what your tradition claims with what other tradition claims, it becomes very difficult to maintain the intellectual certainty that religious authority requires. Exposure to diverse perspective challenges the claim of any particular worldview, which is why people in multicultural, cosmopolitan society tends to be less religious. This is not a spiritual failure. This is what happens when critical thinking is applied to inherent belief, and it is philosophically exactly what the greatest mind in the Western history said would happen. Part 3: Gen Z's Value, the Ethics Argument. But it's not the only information, it's values, as one young person articulated it. Due to Gen Z's awareness of social issues, and specifically problems within a lot of institutions and churches, this makes us less open to the idea of being a part of these institutions. I don't think this meant that Gen Z is less moral. If anything, I think it's the opposite. One of the reasons we are so active in social media is because we understand that we don't need to fit inside the guidelines of the institutionalized religions. We are creating our own belief system. This is not an empathy. This is a generation that has watching organized religion defend position they find indefensible on LGBTQ rights, on women's bodily autonomy, and on the treatment of abuse survivors, on the relationship between religious authority and political power. They have seen clergy protect predators. They have seen churches actively campaigns to deny rights, to fight friends and family members. They have seen the gap between what religion preaches and what religious institute practices, and they have decided collectively that they will not be complicit. Research found that young people see a gap between what they care about and the values espoused and practiced by the traditional religious institutions. Through the majority of young people consider themselves at least slightly religious or spiritual. Most aren't turning to religious institutions in times of difficulty, and crucially, they don't need to. The old threat no longer works. For most of history, religion has a weapon: social exile. Leave the church and you leave the community. Leave the faith and you will lose your family's approval, your neighbor's trust, your social standing. The cost of disbelief was enormous, and people stayed even when they doubted. They performed, they kept quiet. Gen Z has online communities, global peer networks, and the documented knowledge that millions of people who have walked away from religion are living full, ethical, meaningful lives. The social cost of living has collapsed, and without the cost, the institution pressure has nothing to enforce itself with. They are, in words of one researcher, no longer using the excuse of ignorance to lean into the safety of organized religion, especially if it is clearly not for them. Part 4: Nietzsche, the philosopher who saw all of this coming. None of this would have surprised Friedrich Nietzsche. In fact, Nietzsche predicted it with a precision that almost eerie in the 1880s, over a century before smartphones, before the internet, before Gen Z. Nietzsche watched the foundation of religious authority beginning to crack under the weight of scientific discovery and philosophical scrutiny, and he said in his famous declaration of that God is dead, This is not over yet, it has barely begun. Let's revisit what Nietzsche actually meant because most people misread him. When Nietzsche said God is dead, he wasn't making a simple atheist argument. He was making sociological and philosophical observation about cultural event that was already happening and could not be revised. For 2000 years in Western civilization, religion, specifically Christianity, have been the foundation of everything, not just theology, not just morality. The entire architecture of meaning, values, and purpose rested on the religious framework. God provided the answer to the deepest human question: why are we here? What is right and wrong? What happens when we die? What makes life worth living? Science, Darwin, geology, physics had been systematically dismantling the factual claims of religion for decades. And Nietzsche saw that as the factual foundation eroded, the entire moral and metaphysical structure built on top of it would eventually follow. His gains was in seeing that this would not happen all at once. It would happen generationally, slowly, then suddenly. And he was right. What we are watching with Gen Z is not the beginning of this process. It is the acceleration of the process that Nietzsche diagnosed in the 19th century, finally reaching the critical mass in 21st. It isn't scientifically accurate. In one of Genealogy of Morality and the Antichrist, he made an argument that is far more philosophically radical. Religion, particularly Christianity, was not a discovery of moral truth, a psychological strategy, a power structure. He traced the origin of Christian morality to what he calls the slave revolt in morality. The moment when the powerless, unable to overcome the power through strength, invented a value system that declared weakness as good, strength as evil, humility became virtue, suffering became noble, pride became sins, and anyone who did not submit to this framework was condemned to cosmic punishment. This, Nietzsche argued, was not the revelation of divine truth. It was the most ingenious power move in human history. The people who had no earthly power made themselves the moral authority of the universe by claiming divine endorsement. He did not say this made individual believers dishonest or evil. The institutional structure of religious moral authority, fundamentally a product of human psychology, human history, and human power dynamics, not God's law, man's invention. And what Gen Z, with their access to philosophy, psychology, history, and comparative religion, looks at the institution and asks who built this and why and who does it serve. They are asking exactly the question Nietzsche was asking, and they are philosophically asking the right question. Part 5: Hume, Russell, and the philosophical case. Nietzsche was not alone. The philosophical case against the foundation of religion's authority had been building for centuries. Let's run through one of the most important arguments. The 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume asked a simple but devastating question about miracles, the central evidence on which most religious truth claims rest. A miracle led by the divination is a violation of laws of nature, are established by the most consistent, most universal, most repeated evidence of human experience. So when someone claims that miracle occurred, that water turned into wine, that dead rose, that the sea parted, you are being asked to accept testimony of that something would happen, which contradicts everything else you know about how the universe works. The probability that the testimony is mistaken, exaggerated, misremembered, or fabricated is always higher than the probability that the laws of nature was actually violated, especially when the testimony comes from ancient sources, transmitted through the centuries of human copying and politically editing. In a world for systematic record keeping, in a world before systematic record keeping, this argument does not prove religion is false. It proves that the evidentiary standards that religion typically asks you to apply, believe because it was written, believe because you were told to, believe because your community believes, is not a reliable path to truth. Bertrand Russell, the teapot. Bertrand Russell, a mathematician, philosopher, Nobel laureate, and one of the most clearest thinkers of 20th century, offered a deceptively simple argument about the burden of proof. He said, if he claims there was a small china teapot orbiting the sun between Earth and Mars, too small to be detected by the telescope, No one could prove him wrong, but that does not mean you should believe it. The burden of proof lies within the person making the extraordinary claim, not with the people who are skeptical of it. Religious ask if the critics to prove God does not exist, which is impossible because you cannot prove the non-existence of something. But Russell's point is that this is wrong question. The right question is what is the positive evidence that God does exist? And when you examine the evidence, the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, each one has been carefully dismantled by philosophers across centuries. Gen Z raised in the environment where the burden of proof matters, where you don't believe medical terms without clinical trials. You don't accept news without verifying sources. You don't trust authority without examining its credential. Has applied the same standard to religion and found it wanting. Sigmund Freud, Religion as a Psychology. Freud, whatever his flaws as scientist, made one argument about religion that remains compelling. In The Future of Illusion, he proposed that God is a psychological construct, specifically a projection of idealized father figure on the cosmos, human overwhelmed by the indifference of nature and terrifying awareness of their own morality, create a benevolent cosmic authority who cares about them, has plans for them, and will protect them. This is not a description of discovery, it is a description of need, and the fact that religious belief correlates so strongly with human psychological needs for meaning, for comfort, for community, for answers to death is exactly what you would predict if Freud were right. Gen Z, the most psychologically literate generation in history, raised on the language of mental health, trauma, cognitive bias, and emotional intelligence, recognizes the pattern. They can see the difference between what they need to be true and what there is evidence for being true, and they are increasingly refusing to collapse that distinction. Part 6. They are not losing morality, they are building better ethics. Here is where I want to address the most common criticism of this departure directly. Religious leaders, worried parents, and conservative commentators look at this Gen Z's exodus from religious and say, without God, there is no morality. Without scripture, there is no ethical foundation. Without church, there is no community. They will become selfish, nihilistic, and lost. The data does not support this. Research consistently shows that Gen Z is more actively engaged with social justice and concerned about inequality, more committed to the well-being of marginalized communities than any previous generation. Young people are more likely to engage in acts of protest and civic action, and many describe these activities as expression of their own deepest values. They are not less moral, they are differently moral, and in many cases more consistently moral, because they are not outsourcing their ethical judgment to an authority. They are doing the harder work of actually reasoning through what is actually right, rather than simply consulting a text and obeying. This is philosophically exactly what Immanuel Kant argued ethics maturity looks like. Kant's concept of the categorical imperative, act according to the principles you could will to be universal laws, requires autonomous moral reasoning, not obedience to divine command. You cannot be morally mature if your morality is simply a performance of compliance. Genius ethics requires genius choices, and Jean-Paul Sartre's existential ethics pointed in the same direction. In a universe without a pre-given divine moral code, the responsibility of ethics is entirely, terrifyingly human. We cannot hide behind God. We cannot hide behind God told me to. We must choose, and in choosing consciously, we become genuinely responsible for what we choose. Gen Z is not avoiding moral responsibility. They are, perhaps, for the first time in Western history, actually taking it without the safety net of divine authority to absorb the weight. Part 7. What they are actually building instead. The story of Gen Z and religion is not purely a story of departure. It is also a story of construction. Young people are more likely to engage with art as a spiritual practice than a player. They are more likely to practice being in nature of meditation than to attend religious service. They are not abandoning the search of depth and meaning. They are pursuing it outside the institutional framework that their parents relied on. They are building something They are building something new, ethical frameworks grounded in empathy rather than scripture, community organized around shared values rather than the shared doctrine, spiritual lives conducted through the philosophy, art, nature, and genuine human connection rather than the ritual and hierarchy. Is it messier than religion? Yes. It is less certain? Absolutely. Does it offer less comfort? In some way, yes. But it is honest. It is the ethics of generation that refuses to believe something simply because they were told to. They refuses to perform faith they don't feel. They refuses to let an ancient institution speak for their conscience. And philosophically, from Socrates' demand to examine the unexamined life, to Kant's insistence on autonomous moral reasoning, to Nietzsche's call to go beyond inherent values and create your own, this is exactly what the greatest thinkers in Western history asked us to do. Gen Zs did not abandon religion on a whim. They examined it, they weighted it, they compared it against everything else available to them in the richest information environment ever created, and they made a choice that is not a spiritual failure. That is exactly what thinking looks like. Nietzsche saw this coming in 1880s. Hume laid the philosophical groundwork in 1700. Russell sharpened it in 20th century, and Gen Z, armed with a smartphone, their access to all human knowledge, with the most diverse and globally connected perspective of any generation in history, is living the conclusion. They are not lost, they are awake. And the question that this moment asks all of us, whether you are religious, spiritual, agnostic, or atheist, this is same question Socrates asked 2500 years ago and died for. Have you actually examined what you believe, or have you simply inherited it? Because the unexamined belief, however comforting, however ancient, however widely shared, is not knowledge, and knowledge, however uncomforting, is always worth having. Think about it. If this video made you think differently about something you were certain of, share it, drop your thoughts below. I genuinely want this conversation. I will see you in the next one.